We're looking at, obviously, application of ADAS model. That's going to be very important. Macro objectives, growth, output gaps. I think obviously the particular thing is related to the policies, demand side and supply side policies. And then at the end, I'm going to just look at a particular essay. Well, we're going to look at two essays, actually, just to show you how they're assessed and or what criteria are used to assess them. So in the aims and objectives, I've just summarized here some of the main things, and really just to emphasize that point, the very last bullet point there, developing confidence in writing essays and what they need to do to write these essays. And in the penultimate point, there's this idea of the chains of reasoning, or the steps they need to be able to take to develop a good answer. They're also here just to make sure for people who aren't specialists, what you're actually required to deliver in this part of the specification with particular reference to ASAD models. Okay, so we're going to start off then with the macro objectives, and these are the ones that you'll find in the specification. You'll notice that we've got economic growth there. We've also got protection of the environment. Some people ask a bit about sustainable growth and all this sort of thing. Now, a few years ago, when this syllabus was actually developed, there was a lot of rather poor definitions of sustainable growth around, particularly in terms of other subjects such as geography, where they kind of defined it as meeting the needs of the present generation without harming the prospects for future generations. And students would often parrot off this sort of definition, and I'd say to them, well, what's wrong with it? Why doesn't it work? And the key thing about that definition is that it doesn't take account of changes in technology. Now, I think more recently there's been far more well, there's been a development in terms of how we define that. So maybe when the spec is redeveloped, that will be included with a clearer definition, well, a more usable definition, I think. Okay, so when we're thinking about the possible conflicts between the objectives, and I put down here some of these: low unemployment, low stable rate of inflation, economic growth, balanced payments equilibrium, economic growth and protection of the environment, budget balance, and greater income equality. Now, quite often, we did in the last session, I showed a little video about the Phillips curve and the potential trade-off between unemployment and inflation. You can see why, if you have rapid growth, that could lead to a rise in imports and therefore problems concerning the current account of the balance of payments. Just talked a bit about growth in the environment, and then budget balance and income equality. Now, I think, again, I've been trying to get your students to, to get your students to think a lot about, to think critically. So why might these not be objectives, but be conflicts? And if you look, what I've done this for you is some ideas. So when you've got low unemployment and low stable rate of inflation, well, we had that in large parts of the 1990s, which largely resulted from supply side changes, particularly globalization and new technology. And all of these things meant there was great increases in aggregate supply, so that inflationary pressures did not really emerge. Well, that's after the early 90s, that is. Similarly, if you think about growth and balanced payments equilibrium, I mean, one of the things I would, again, get your students to think about is, why might that not be a problem? Think of particular countries, and you can think perhaps of countries like Singapore or China. Get them to explore how they've managed to grow without having huge current account or balance of trade deficits. So that's a really, useful thing to think of case studies like that. And then when you think about growth and protection of the environment, well, if you have high growth, necessarily tax revenues are much higher, and therefore governments have more resources in a way to deal with environmental issues. so that's a way in which they may not conflict. And similarly with budget balance and income inequality, well, okay, if you've got budget balance, the government might be making the tax system more progressive, and it can then use some of the revenues from that to help poorer people. They've tried to increase the national minimum wage, although there's quite a bit of economic debate about whether really that is a good means of reducing inequality, and other policies to promote more rapid economic growth, which, this again is largely discredited trickle down in economics, where you have higher growth and then that will trickle down to people on lower incomes. But nevertheless, there are possibilities there. Okay, so when we think about the trade cycle, first of all, we need to think about this two important definitions, really: actual growth and potential growth, and production and productivity. When we're talking about actual growth, you're really looking at percentage increase in real GDP, that's discounting inflation, usually caused by an increase in aggregate demand. What economists like to think of as growth, particularly as potential growth, is the increase in productive potential, as evidenced by an increase in LRAS, the long run aggregate supply curve that we touched on last time. Now, in discussing these whole issues, many students, when they look at the ideas of production and productivity, get totally confused, and they use the terms interchangeably. And so this brings me back to a point I think I made in probably session 1 or 2 about the real significance of precision in economics. So when they're talking about production, they've got to be talking about the actual amount produced. Productivity and the productivity rate, the increase in output per worker per hour work, that's the usual way in which it's defined. And so be very severe on your students if they muddle up these terms. As with all things in economics, the precise definitions are really, really important. And they can lose a lot of marks by writing a whole essay about production when they're meant to be talking about productivity. And I then just said, well, for what areas of the specification is productivity relevant? I keep coming back to this. Obviously, it's a very important issue at the moment, not just for UK, but for many economies, developed economies particularly. And if you think just have a second or two to think of any one item, you could think, well, why is productivity important? Can you think of another part of the spec where it's important? Just give you a second to do that. And the sort of issues here, probably still thinking about these things, but if you think back to what we covered in previous sessions, you'll know that you can think it might be relevant to exports, to our international competitiveness, to wages, because obviously if you have a highly productive workforce, they're likely to get higher wages. It affects the costs of businesses, average costs, and therefore their profits. It's obviously relevant in a discussion of supply side policies and long run aggregate supply, economic growth, and so on. So it's really just to get the ideas across here that, again, I'm just trying to get you to help your students to think across the whole spec, to think of interrelationships, because so many things in economics are weaved together. And the earlier they build up that idea of being able to interconnect things, the better they will do. And thank you, somebody, Arna has written international competitiveness, absolutely right. So I've just put here, just a second, something on the causes of long-run economic growth. Now, you can see here, obviously things like new natural resources, investment, we always talk about investment, size of working population, improvement in human capital, the quality of that is of the working population, new technology. And I then put for your students, think about this. How might each of the factors 2 to 5 be increased? So what could you do then? Well, I've put here reduce for investment, reduce income tax, tax breaks on investment, encourage FDI by lowering admin costs. The working population, obviously there's a sensitive issue about immigration, but childcare provision has proved to be a really important thing. Tax breaks for parents. Some countries make direct payments to parents to have children, for example, Japan and Estonia. And so worth again getting your students to do some case studies on that. Clearly at the moment, for our country in particular, there's a sizable proportion of the adult working population are inactive, and that raises all kinds of other issues about healthcare and mental health and so on. Human capital, obviously, we're therefore talking about education, apprenticeships. I believe the Prime Minister was talking about apprenticeships earlier today. And then new technology, developing business-friendly environments. It's got to be easy to set up your business. It's got to be, you've got to know that there is a strong legal framework. You've got to know that institutions are sound and will help in the process. Some countries have scored much better than others on that. And then again, I've just got you to think for 1 minute what other factors might affect a country's growth rate. So we can see there resources, investment, population, human capital, technology. But in practice, are there other things that influence a country's growth rate? And just have a quick think about that for a moment. Again, if you think about this in relation to countries around the world, several things become apparent, like political stability. Clearly, if countries at war, then you've got real problems, but political stability. I mean, if there's instability, that is going to act as a real deterrent to things like investment. So that's really important. Things like the degree of regulation in the economy, and whether that, if you know, it goes back to, I suppose, whether the country is business friendly or not. What factors might influence a participation rate? We talked a bit about the health thing, but there are other factors, cultural factors maybe, other things. All those things can have an impact on on a country's economic growth rate. And so let's just move on then. So I put here, why is an increase in productivity important for the economy? And again here, this is for your students really to think about this. Get them all the time to think. And I've put down here a few ideas. I mean, obviously for workers, if productivity is high, it is more likely that the workers are going to be better paid because they are more productive, there's more value added, etc. For consumers, again, linking this up with previous work they've done, not only lower prices, but remember that means higher consumer surplus, something we did in theme 1. And obviously increased living standards because they can now afford more goods and services. For businesses, if productivity is high, then there's going to be lower costs per unit and get higher profits. For the government, well, with higher productivity and higher growth rates, they're going to get higher tax revenues. And then there's the opportunity of spending that on things like health service without having to cut expenditures elsewhere. For the balance of trade, you're going to again get this reduced cost of production, increased competitiveness of exports, and consequently an improvement in balanced trade. So again, it's getting them to think laterally, getting them to think about the wider implications of this particular concept, productivity, really important, and see the interrelationships between this and other parts of the spec. Okay, let's think then about the trade cycle. Well, you get this idea of I mean, it's defined differently, but it's obviously the simple idea that the economy fluctuates, and it fluctuates from more prosperous times, boom times, to perhaps more recessionary times. And these trade cycles are going to be associated with changes in income, employment, unemployment, output, rate of inflation, profits. And again, it's really important to try and get the students to think about what are the likely features of different parts of the trade cycle. Now, I've just put down here a downturn. From UK experience, it's probably, in current circumstances, not quite so easy. I mean, yes, in a downturn, you're likely to see a fall in the rate of inflation. And indeed, it appears we've had a very slight recession and the rate of inflation is coming down. Unemployment, however, has not really risen very significantly. So this is a bit of an odd feature of our current trade cycle. When you think about profits of firms, well, some of those have suffered quite badly. And I'm sure you've been reading just recently that there's record numbers of companies calling in the administrators. So it's really quite a big issue. So, I mean, certainly pick up on that point. There's quite a bit of data around now, and I'm sure we're going to hear some fairly biggish companies might go to the wall. And those of you who teach business, you can really link this into your business, because what we're seeing is many of these companies, businesses have got high debts. The high interest rates have therefore increased the burden of those debts. They are facing higher costs, more from obviously last year from energy prices, but other raw material prices and so on. And some of them are now just feeling they are no longer viable. And with the debts, they're no longer serviceable. So they're going to go bust. So we've had, as I'm sure your business teachers will know, a lot of what they call zombie companies. And it seems a number of those are now in real trouble. So it's worth exploring that idea with your students. This is a diagram that some sort of diagram you might use. Got here the trend rate of growth, this dotted line. And many economies will go through this sort of cycle to a greater or lesser extent. And just to show the importance of learning this was a question, as you can see, from an exam paper, and point Z in the diagram, which is the following is likely to occur. From all of those options, you can see straight away the only possible one probably is the inflation one, because here actual GDP is growing at a faster rate than the trend. So you're going to expect there to be some sort of problems in terms of resource availability, and therefore pushing up the costs of whether it's labor, raw materials, or whatever. So it just gives you an idea how to tackle that. It also makes us think about positive and negative output gaps. Now at Z, we've got a positive output gap. Down at the bottom of here, where growth is below the trend, we'd have a negative output gap between the trend and the actual GDP. So the negative one may be illustrated by an ADAS diagram. So you've got average price level, you've got the real GDP. Now notice that where LRAS, this is a Keynesian LRAS or an AS curve, where it's vertical, that's the full employment level of real output. But if the equilibrium is at Y1, and you've got price level of P1 and a real output of Y1, then there's a negative output gap. And remember, in the Keynesian sort of analysis, there'd be nothing, unless government does intervenes, there'd be nothing to change that. So you'd stick at Y1. So that's a negative output gap. And to show the positive one, this is done with classical, the vertical long run average aggregate supply curve. You also got a short run one. Now you can see at this point here, the equilibrium where SRS cuts LRS and AD cuts the two of them, that is the full employment level of real output. Now, Just as before, you can show again the negative output gap. If you were at Y1 and the economy was stuck in equilibrium at that level, then there'd be Y1, YFE is a negative output gap. However, in the short term, it's possible the economy could be operating at Y2. And that means, just as in this diagram here, you would have a positive output gap. The actual GDP is running at a higher rate than the trend growth rate associated with full employment. So this is in the spec, so it's something that you will need to teach your pupils, and this is just one way of doing that. Okay, let's move on to circular flow of income. Now, a very simple model you can start off with is households and firms. And this is just to simplify things, makes it very easy two-sector economy, just households and firms. And obviously here you've got the real flow of goods and services, the workers, the factors of production, land, labour, capital. Firms produce goods. This is a real flow of output. Now, households will then, they've obviously got their wages, for example, so they've then got money to buy goods and services, and so it goes like that. So in theory, this of course does not ever happen. A country's national expenditure should equal its national output, should equal its national income. Now, of course, that doesn't happen because there's all kinds of, well, illegal activities for one thing, and output that isn't recorded for another. But anyway, that's what should happen. Now, the next slide simply shows this in a more complicated way, showing, well, it hasn't included all the other elements, but what it shows is that there are both withdrawals from the circular flow in the form of savings, imports, taxes, and, oh, that's missed out for some reason, the injections this side, on the right-hand side, investment, exports, and government spending. And so within that circular flow, there are withdrawals and injections. And that is going to be important for working out what's called the multiplier. And this is obviously a concept that students do need to understand. So just given a simple definition, that multiplier describes a process whereby a change in injection, that's government expenditure, investment or exports, causes a greater percentage change in GDP. Now note that it can be in either direction. So if say government expenditure goes up, well, it'll have a positive effect on GDP, but it could go down, in which case have a negative effect. That's what that means. Now, the consumption by itself does not have a multiplier effect, but it does cause a change in the marginal propensity to consume. And that will cause the value of the multiplier to change. Now, the MPC, remember, is just the change in consumption divided by the change in income. And really, to get your students to understand these concepts, they just need to, our consumers can spend a bigger or smaller proportion of their income. If they decide that they're going, confidence is high, I don't know, real wages going up, house prices going up, whatever it is, then the MPC may rise. So they'll be spending a higher proportion of their income. And that will cause the value of the multiplier to go up. And conversely, if they decide to spend less, lack of confidence, I don't know, higher mortgage costs, all the things that happened perhaps in the shallow recession we've had, then the MPC would go down. So the calculation, now I've just done the simple calculations, how it may be calculated. So if you're given information on national income or one of the injections, you can work out the value of the multiplier that way. If you're given information, say, on the marginal propensity to consume, you can work it out that way. Similarly, or conversely really, K multiplier is 1 over 1 minus MPC, therefore it must be 1 over the MPW, because the MPC plus all these leakages, marginal savings, taxes, imports, must equal to 1. So MPW is simply the sum of those three: MPS, MPT, MPM. So here's one way to explain the process, because what you have to remember when explaining this to your students is that it is a sort of continuous process. Eventually it will fizzle out. So I've put here, supposing you've got a £200 million injection, it's like government spending. Also assuming the value of the MPS is 0.1, MP2 0.2, and MPM 0.2. So how much is saved, taxed and imported at the last stage in this diagram? Well, in the first stage, you'll see you've got £200 million injection. So if the MPS is 0.1, that means 20 million saved. The MP2 and MPM are 0.2 each, then there's 40 million taxed, 40 million imported. And then the process continues. And so you've got this, the next stage carries on in the same way. And in this last stage, you see, I haven't put that. So if you've got 100 million, it's now gone down to 100 million in the circular flow. Well, in that case, you're going to get 10 million saved, 20 million taxed, 20 million imported, and leaving an extra 50 billion to carry on in the next stage. So what this diagram really shows is this process of where eventually the leakages will get larger, as it were, as a proportion of the extra GDP, and the process will phase out. What you're often asked in questions is something like this, where, so this is, you can see where this has come from. After global financial crisis, US president introduced expansionary fiscal policies of $800 billion. The IMF estimated the multiplier at the time was 1.5. Now, the first question was, which was a withdrawal? Well, we know from what we've just done, the first three there are injections, so taxation is clearly the answer. Then you have to calculate the final increase in aggregate demand as a result of the president's expansionary fiscal policies. Now, I'll just take you back to this. So remember those numbers, 1.5, 800 billion. So what we know here is the value of the multiplier is 1.5. The injection is 800 million. So the change in Y will be 1,200 billion, I think it was, wasn't it? So it's really just to get them to be able to use those equations, and this is a sort of question, theoretically you could get. You can notice this source that's come from The Economist as a matter of interest. Now, I mentioned before, and we've seen a couple of these videos relating to bits of things we've seen. And I just mentioned one here, the paradox of thrift. And this again is just a 1-minute video. And I'm just seeing, I can't see, I've got this, just check if I've got it on my screen, just a moment. Don't know that I've got it to hand, but just a second. Yeah. Okay, so I'll just show you this now. Just share the screen again. Oh, sorry.
Number 2, the paradox of thrift. Much like a child getting his pocket money, one of the biggest economic questions is still whether it's better to save or spend. Free marketeers like Hayek and Milton Friedman say that even in difficult times, it's best to be thrifty and save. Banks then channel the savings into investment in new plants, skills and techniques that let us produce more. And even if this new technology destroys jobs, wages will drop and businesses hire more people. So unemployment falls again. Simple, at least in the long run. But then a live fast, die young kind of chap called John Maynard Keynes cheerfully pointed out that in the long run, we're all dead. So to avoid the misery of unemployment, the government should instead spend money to create jobs. Whereas if the government tightens its belt when people and businesses are doing the same, less is spent, so unemployment gets even worse. That is the paradox of thrift. So instead they should spend now and tax later when everyone's happy to pay. Though making people happy to pay tax was something even Keynes didn't solve. Number 3, the Phillips curve. Bill Phillips was a crocodile hunter and economist from New Zealand who spotted...
Right, okay. So let me get that, go back to what we're doing. Right, okay, so the point of showing you that was, this is, again, something that you do need to deliver to your students, but it's this idea that whereas it might make sense for an individual household or an individual person to save more, if everyone does that, then what will happen is total incomes will go down and total savings will go down. Now, it seems counterintuitive, but that's what happens. And what Keynes's point was that if we were in a huge recession or depression, then it will be up to the government to inject money into the economy to lift us out of that recession or depression. So it's quite an important concept. So it's, as I say, it's just that idea that if everyone tries to save more, in fact, total savings in the whole economy will go down because national income, GDP, will fall. So anyway, 1 minute explanation from David Mitchell there. I hope that helps a bit. All right, let's go on to the policies now. And I've put here the 3 types. Now, the direct controls we have seen a little bit of in theme 1, where we're talking about minimum prices. But generally speaking, for now, we're going to focus particularly on demand side and supply side. And these are very simple, really, because...
Quinton, could you show your screen?
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry. So thank you, Colin. I forgot to share it again. Apologies. Let me just go back just a second.
I can share mine. I've just shared mine if that's easier.
Yeah, do you mind? For some reason, this has just gone.
Just prompt me to change the slides. Can you see mine? Can you?
Yeah, I can see yours at the moment. Yeah. So we need to be, yeah, we're on the right page. All right. If you could just move to the next one then, please. Yeah. Okay. So what we're looking at then is demand side and supply side policies. So we've got here the demand ones obviously influence AED, supply ones influence designed to increase long run aggregate supply or productive capacity. As I say, forget the direct controls now, I'll come back to that in theme 4. And then moving on, I've just put on the next slide, we can see here, what are these demand side policies? Well, you can split them up into fiscal policies, dealing with the tax and government expenditure, monetary policies, and I put here quantitative easing and quantitative tightening. Now, QT isn't actually in the spec, but bear in mind that is what's happening in the UK and other countries at the moment. So perhaps your students ought to be aware of that, and changes in interest rates. And again, the exchange rate is again regarded as a demand side policy. And in some countries, of course, they have managed exchange rates, whereas we have floating exchange rates. Now, again, we'll come back to that more in theme 4. So moving on to supply side policies, as we said, they're designed to increase productive potential. Now, the critical distinction to make here is this difference between market orientated and interventionist policies. And as the term suggests, the market orientated ones are based on the use of market forces or enhancing their use, whereas the interventionist ones, it usually involve some intervention by the state, usually in the form of some form of government spending, perhaps. Okay, so those are the key policies that your students need to be made aware of. If we move down, you can see that these market-orientated supply-side policies involve various things like measures to increase incentives. And what I've done here is to give some examples. So for businesses, it might be reducing corporation tax. For individuals, for workers, might be involved reducing welfare payments to provide an incentive for their unemployed to get jobs, for example. Promotion of competition, and then the usual sort of things, deregulation, privatisation, etc. Measures to increase labour market flexibility, and we've seen this in the last 30 years, reducing trade union power, reduction in regulations, promotion of immigration, and then measures to increase productivity that we discussed earlier on. Okay, So that's the market-orientated ones. If we could go to the interventionist ones, these you can see usually involve various amounts of government expenditure, and they're again the sort of things we've mentioned previously in today's session. I mean, industrial strategy should probably have a question mark by it, because we probably don't have a defined industrial strategy, although the government has set up, for example, these free ports and various bits and pieces, but there's no sort of coherent approach. Now that again may be changing if we have a change of government, I don't know. Okay, so those are the main policies. Now we're going on to think about the essays, and I want to just pick out a few things here, and then we're going to look at an essay and so on. So the first thing is just a few strategies for your students about the timing. I think one of the things really important that students sometimes forget is that they spend too long on these questions that are 4 marks, 5 marks, 2 marks, whatever it is. And then they come to the essay and they haven't got time to really write a good essay, which of course is worth 25 marks. I think planning, you don't want to spend too much time on it, but you need to have some idea about where you're going. The developing the arguments, the steps in those arguments are really important. The reference to context, and I put here use evidence, example stated, but I mean it's this reference to some sort of context. Many of the essays, for example, in paper 3, they're all based on the data, or they've got some relationship with the data that you students will have been looking at. I've suggested here that evaluation might be better at the end of each line of argument rather than all dumped at the end and done often very briefly and not very well. Although to access the highest marks for evaluation, it's good to include in some sort of informed judgment. And this, of course, must not just be a summary of what they've written before, but some sort of idea. I mean, an example I've given to some people before is, supposing you have a question about the benefits of economic growth. And so they might write, various paragraphs and things. How would you finish it up? Well, you might say that, yes, the benefits are increased living standards, but economic growth is perhaps more important for countries where GDP per capita is very, very low than it is for a richer country. And why is that? Because when GDP is very, very low, these people may not even have enough income or resources to feed themselves and their families. So it's more important for them than it would be for a country like UK, USA, etc. Okay, so let's move on from that. And just a summary of a few points about evaluation. I won't run through all these things, but I think I'll just pick out one here, the magnitude of the effect. Now, sometimes students will say, get a question, it says, oh, the value of the Nigerian currency has fallen 40% or something. And then at the end, they'll be evaluated and they, evaluate the effects of depreciation. And then what a student will then say, well, it depends how big the depreciation is. And they've ignored the context. And that is, are you going to get any credit for that? I mean, well, I don't think so, because you've been told it's 40%. What you need to be encouraging your students to do is say, right, this is a huge depreciation. It is going to have a very, very significant effect on the price of imports, for example, and so on. And that's the sort of idea in evaluation, rather than just saying it depends on the size. That would be level 1 evaluation. It doesn't get you anywhere. Okay, now what we're going to look at now, if I can just find this on my screen, just a second. Yeah, thank you, Colin. If you've got the delegate, booklets, do you mind can you just go down to the second essay, which is on page 6. On page 6, right, okay. Now, I'm going to go through bits of this with you. So this was one that was asked in 2018. In 2016, the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer announced that the government would spend an extra £23 billion on innovation and infrastructure over the following 5 years. Evaluate the likely economic effects of this planned increase in government expenditure. Okay, now I'm going to just talk you a bit through this. So if we go through each page in turn. So the first bit just talks about what infrastructure is, and talk about transport buildings. Then if you look at the top of the next bit, the second line, innovation. Oh, sorry, can you just go back a minute? Innovation is known as new ideas and concept. So there's a couple of level ones here. He's just explaining a couple of terms. Then he talks down here about an improvement in transport, shows less barriers to trade, but also can bring production costs down to firms operating in the UK. This can lead to higher profits, which could result in more investment and so show economic growth in the economy. And that's it. And what you can see here is it's really just like a two-stage chain of reasoning. It's not taking us very far. And in the criteria for level 2, it actually says a narrow response or superficial two-stage chains of reasoning only. So for this little bit, and this is how examiners will usually mark these, they'll look at that and say, well, for that paragraph, I can't give it more than level 2. So they give that a level 2. And then he's got a however. An improvement in transport will not happen overnight, so could negatively affect the economy for a short period of time that it takes to improve the transports. The negative effects could mean that workers have longer travels to work and so more stress. I mean, again, this is kind of going off the point, because what he's trying to say is they have longer travel. Well, they've got that now. So again, it's only about a level 1 for evaluation for that. Then moving on to the next page, we can see that if we go to this bit where it says another benefit from an improvement in infrastructure, it could be said that schools are part of infrastructure. This means that improved schools, we could see in the long run an increase in productivity and economic growth, which will improve the economy. And then it's going on to some evaluation again. So do you see what, again, there's not a lot here. It's just picking out a few bits, more education, higher productivity, and a bit of economic growth. And then how the quality of schools can be hard to measure, takes a long time to, this is all pretty thin evaluation. So you kind of got a level 2 for KAA, a level 1 for evaluation. And then at the bottom of the page goes on to Chancellor of the Exchequer announced in 2016, government would spend next 23 billion on infrastructure innovation. Could be beneficial to the economy. One benefit from innovation could be increased new ideas leading to new markets. This would lead to huge demand, and so would lead to big profit. I mean, again, notice as well what's weak about this is there's no proper context, there's no real examples. And then the new infrastructure improvement could lead firms in other countries move into the UK to take advantage of the quick transportation of goods and services. This could be similar to capital flight. Well, that's very dubious. So it kind of goes off the point a bit. Anyway, then says this could, at the bottom, this could benefit the UK, means there are more companies paying corporation tax. This means the government will, if we could carry on to the next page, they'll receive higher tax revenue. So again, a bit more level 2 analysis. So overall, this answer would have got no more than a level 2. And you can see I've copied this from the exam report actually in red at the bottom. Candidate failed to develop their answer. Answer fits squarely into level 3 description, narrow response, superficial, two-stage chains of reason only. In terms of evaluation, limited evaluation only. So that's what you can see. Right, now one of the ones you just have a look at fairly briefly, just have a quick scan of it, is the first essay in your delegate pack, which is at the start of the pack. And this essay, if we could go to, yeah, that's it. This essay says in 2022, Japan's productivity was approximately 30% lower than that of the USA. Evaluate supply side policies that a government could use to increase the country's productivity. Now, just point out here, This essay actually comes from an international A-level paper, and you've all got access to these. So if you want to use these as slightly different mark bases and everything, but this essay could equally have been asked in relation to the domestic paper or in relation to the UK economy. So you can use some of these from the IAL. Now just have a quick scan through this and just have a think. Well, I think the first thing to say is it better or worse than the last one? If you want to put levels for KAA and evaluation, do so. So I'll just give you a few minutes to have a quick scan through it, and then I'll tell you what this was awarded. Through this fairly quickly. I hope the main thing you will have got from this that it did turn out to be better than the previous one. In this first paragraph, again, there's a couple of definitions, level 1 type things. The second paragraph about infrastructure, again, there was some context. There was a bit more reasoning in it. It would certainly be at least level 3. Over the page, secondly, this one about China and low productivity, and then in talking about Chinese government could invest more in education. Then he gave an example that he knew about. He may be a Chinese candidate, I don't know. But that's, by the way, the point is put it in a context. He's talking about learning greater variety of skills. He's talking about higher productivity, talking about how to communicate and cooperate with others efficiently, and all this sort of thing. So that was good. And then the next paragraph, furthermore, that one starting off again, gives a good example about the private sector aiming, it's talking about privatization, aiming at profit maximization, experience fierce competition, may have higher productivity. In other words, private sector firm, if it fails to become more productive, its high unit cost will lead to bankruptcy. You know, it's got a chain of reasoning going on there. And then on the next page, there's some evaluation. So he talks first of all about opportunity cost in that first point about Japanese government. But again, he's put it in a context. He's said what the opportunity cost might be. And so there's some good evaluation there. And then in addition, he's talking about government failure, that what could happen is that with a compulsory education could lead to crowding out, etc., etc. So again, there's a bit more depth to this answer. And on the final page, again, he talks about the danger of profit of monopoly arising with privatization. So he's kind of looked at the 3 points he's made, tried to do some evaluation of each of them. So, you know, this is obviously a much sounder answer than the previous one. All right, we could just go back to the last couple of slides just to summarize what we've been doing. So I've just put here, approaching these essays, reading the essay carefully. I mean, so often you see in essays, candidates asked to talk about effects and they talk about causes, and it's just reading that question very carefully. The second issue is really focusing on the question that's been said. Some candidates like to look at, you know, oh, these questions might come up, or, you know, and then they pre-rehearse an answer, and then they don't really address the question properly. Really important, the third point here is including relevant and accurate diagrams. I mean, one of the, I think, weaknesses of both those essays is there were no diagrams when quite clearly they could have been used. And the one about government spending, the first one, they could have included multiplier, for example, but they could have included ASAD. The problem with sometimes, mentioned this before, is they draw beautiful diagrams, but they don't refer to them in their answer, in their written analysis. And similarly, for the evaluation, is just this generic evaluation is a pitfall. The best approach is to try and evaluate in the context of the question in relation to the points they've made. Okay, so to summarize what we've done today is, again, getting your students to develop these critical thinking skills. Certainly we looked at that in relation to macroeconomic objectives. Developing the quantitative skills, which are going to be important because you can see how easy it is to ask one of those in multiple choice or in short answer questions. Understanding the different demand side policies, and similarly really making sure with supply side they understand the difference between market-based and interventionist, because that is in the spec, they need to know that. And this idea of multi-steps in explanations, that's going to get them a higher mark than writing, say in those essays we just looked at, they've written 10 points. That's never going to get there, because they won't have enough time to develop each of those points properly. It's better to stick to 2 or 3 and do those well and evaluate those well, and using diagrams and so on. Okay, so I think then there's just, oh yes, if this is what I just put this down, we're looking at themes 3 and 4. If you want me to cover anything in particular, please put that in the chat box, and I will certainly try and incorporate some of that in the next session. Now, the next session is actually next Tuesday. So if you're available for that, please sign up for that. And then we have some more after Easter break. So I think the one following that is April the 16th. So as I say, the next one is March the 26th and then April 16th. Okay, well, thank you very much. I know we've gone on a bit, and I apologise for the problem with my computer, but there you are. Colin rescued us.